Welcome to another episode of the SaassTrana podcast. Today we have with us Girish, co-founder and CEO at Sprinto. Sprinto is in the business of providing compliance automation solution and is a SaaS company. Today in this podcast, Girish is going to take a deeper dive at ISO 27001 compliances. He is not only going to talk about the specifics about what it entails, but also talk about some of the commonalities that it shares with other compliances such as SOC2 and what can be done by organization to get more effective and get speed in achieving these certifications and compliances checkmark. Welcome to the Sastrana podcast, Girish. Pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Venkatesh. Really excited to be here.
Okay. Yeah. Can you introduce yourself a little bit about yourself and what you do, Girish?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Girish. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of Sprinto. Sprinto is a platform that helps companies automate their journey to security and privacy compliances like SOC2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, GDPR. And if that sounds like an alphabet soup, I don't blame you. These are certifications that you need as a company to prove that you follow adequate security practices. Typically, obtaining these compliances takes hundreds of hours of manual effort and expertise, and Sprinto helps you automate this journey and get the 10x faster. Personally, I'm an engineer first. I'm happiest when I'm writing code and building product, though I don't get to do it as much as I'd like these days. And Sprinto isn't my first SaaS company. I co-founded and exited another SaaS company before this called RecruiterBox. Grew it to a reasonable scale before I started working on Sprinto. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, fantastic. I think seems like the Sprinto is the founding team is basically the recruiter box mafia. I mean, I had a podcast with another co-founder of yours a couple of months back as well. That was on SOC 2, but today you mentioned you're in the space of making compliance easier. And yeah, to be honest, it does sound like an alphabet soup. But yeah, I think that probably is an opportunity for you to make it easy for people like us or any other businesses to make it less painful and understand it and give more clarity. That's what is a domain Sprinto seems to be working on. In this podcast, I really want to pick on ISO 27001 and delve deeper into it. But before getting into this, just on how did you come up with this idea of founding this business and pick compliance automation as a space for Sprinto?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, this is like a boring, unsexy space. So you don't come across it unless you have had some prior experience with it, and that's kind of what happened with me and my co-founder. So when we were running our previous SaaS company, and as we were trying to win larger and larger deals, where there was a lot of security reviews involved, and this is the time when we got asked about questions around the security posture about the company. Compliances like SOC 2 and ISO, and we try to do it the traditional way, which is talking to like a bunch of consultants, trying to manually get all of these things in place. And long story short, it wasn't a very pleasant experience. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemies. But the thing is, it took a lot of time, effort, energy, money, and there was sort of the germination of the idea that, hey, this can actually be a lot easier. It doesn't have to be as hard. And, there should be a way to do this, something as important as this, in a much more painless manner. So that was kind of my initiation, if you will, to the whole space. It happened incidentally, but I'm glad it happened.
Good. I think, yeah, I mean, some of the largest of enterprises and problems on SaaS startup starts with a tingle that gets created. And typically the tingle is created based on a problem that we face on something else that we do, either in our personal life or work life. So, and yeah, I mean, even though you started off saying it's a boring space, it is even more boring to face the problem in this space. I mean, I work in the cybersecurity space, and what makes it really sexy is we eliminate the boredom from our stakeholders and make it easy for them. And that's probably what makes it exciting in this space, right?
Yeah.
So eliminate the evilness of boredom from our stakeholders, and they get value and probably get excited so that they don't have to spend time on it. Very, very good journey, and Girish, and certainly I can relate to the pain point because even though I am living and breathing and I am in the cybersecurity business, we also have to deal with compliances. We also have to deal with the regulations, and we also have to deal with not just for ourselves and our infrastructure. We also have to enable our customers meet those regulatory frameworks and guidance and that they work on, RBI for banks and different sets of frameworks and guidelines and regulations. But on ISO 27001, I mean, I looked at a profile and I also heard before we set up the meeting that you have a lot of ISO 27001 experience and implementation. Can you throw me a little bit of color on how did you get that? What makes you an ISO 27001 expert?
I don't know about expert, but the way we learned whatever we did in the process is by actually doing it. So I remember, when we were first developing Sprinto in the first few months, we thought that the best way to learn the ropes of anything like compliance is to go through the process ourselves. And believe it or not, we actually used to get ourselves audited multiple times. Sometimes SOC2, sometimes ISO, and so on and so forth. So in a way, it was our favorite pastime. And we learned a lot through that process, what exactly is ISO 27001, because it's one thing to read about this theoretically, and there is a lot of online content about what ISO 27000 really means. But to do it yourself, to understand how auditors look at it, what do they expect from you when they're going through this, and how different auditors might have slightly different ways of looking at something, what variations happen between them, what they expect of you, etc. These are all the things that we learned on the ground. So in the sense, it wasn't something that we believed that we could learn by second-hand information. And we actually did that ourselves too. That was the first way we sort of, gathered like a lot of expertise in what the process itself means and what the certification means. Post that, of course, we also have an internal team of people who are lead auditors and who have done this before. And they help us keep abreast with whatever changes happen in this space and the nuances of the space and what the compliance really means. So now we depend on that. But in the beginning, we actually bridged that gap by literally going through scores of audits ourselves.
Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. I think, yeah, so there is a saying, the only shortcut to gaining the expertise is actually doing it, right? And that's probably why you probably gain that expertise by going through the entire process, understanding it, doing it yourself. But for somebody, a layman, I mean, one of the things about my favorite line is one of the things about standards is there are too many of them to choose from, right? So it's kind of a paradox there, right? But in simple terms, what exactly is ISO 27001 and certification? What exactly is 27001 certification?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll try to explain this with as less jargon as possible, so that it makes sense to someone who is not necessarily from the area as well. First the jargon of what it is supposed to mean. So ISO 27001 is a series of specifications on how you should actually run what is called an information security management system, or an ISMS. Now that's a mouthful, but the point over here is that it is designed to help you design a information security program, which is a program that will help you keep whatever sensitive data that you handle as a company safe and secure. But it's I think the very interesting thing about ISO 27001, which I didn't know at the beginning, is that it is designed not just to be a series of checklists that you should follow, but it is actually designed to help you design a system that comes up with a security program. So it's not a security program itself. It's about a system that will give you the security program. So, and I think that's a very small but important distinction, which means that, if you have this in place, it will not only help you create the program to begin with, but it'll also help you understand how to maintain it, how to improve it, and how to actually make sure it gets audited or certified by a third-party body. Right, so it has all these components baked into it. So it's designed to be a way for help you implement a program, to maintain it, to improve it, and to get itself audited. And I think that's in a way somewhat beautiful about the way it's actually it's intended to be. So it's a way for you to sort of make sure that you as an organization follow the right security practices, come up with the right security practices that are correct for you. Each organization is different. And then continue to improve on them over time as well. So I think that's the main intent of this program.
Okay. Okay. So what you're saying is it is not a security. It basically it enables you to meet security related. It makes you more ready to meet with those security related challenges by meeting the ISO 27001 compliances or certification. But it by itself is not a security program. Is that accurate assessment or?
Yeah, it is somewhat prescriptive. It does have a few prescriptions, but it is not binding in terms of that, okay, this is exactly ABC that you need to do. The way they actually talk about it is that what you need to do is do ABC to create a system that will actually tell you your security program. And that makes sense, right? Because every company is different. You cannot apply the same program across different kinds of companies in different industries and geographies, etc. And you know, it's written in a manner that you can evolve the program to meet your own specific requirements, while the requirements are itself on or ISO's requirements are on the structure of the program, not the specifics of the program itself.
Okay. Okay. Let me try to think of an analogy and throw in again here. And if I'm way off the radar, let me know. Brutally honest. No, don't worry about it. But the analogy I can think of is, see, my co-founder is a ex-cricketer, right? So, so we have a lot of analogy that goes with sports. And being cricket as well. So based on the way he explained it to me it seems like, yeah, when you get into sports, you have to go out there in the field and in a competitive match to eventually play well and win it. But you cannot be playing matches every day, but you have to have a process to get there and play well. So you have a combination of fitness, diets, practice sessions and everything. And that becomes a program for you to eventually be ready for playing as many matches as possible. So is it fair to say that the certification is a program that enables you to be ready for those matches? In this case, the match being security related issues, challenges, and other things.
Actually, I think it's a wonderful analogy. It is actually right. It is more about the process that you follow on an ongoing basis, which will give you the eventual results that you want. Okay.
Fantastic. Thanks. I thought I was just making it up, but I'm glad to know that at least I'm somewhat spot on. All right. So certification, ISO 7000 certification, even though to me, it seems like everybody should get it, but not everybody gets it. So who are the top people who should be getting it and is a must have for them? Who should consider getting certified for ISO 27001?
Right. So, so if we just work backwards from what the certification means, then that is a little bit simple to derive. So fundamentally, the company that gets an ISO 27001 program is a company that needs to demonstrate its commitment to security to somebody external, like to an external stakeholder. Now that stakeholder could be a customer, it could be a prospect, it could be a partner, it could be a cybersecurity insurer, it could be your board of directors, but it is someone outside of the company who needs some assurance that you follow the right security practices. That's the main goal of the program, because that is where you're depending on a certified third party to give you the certification that, hey, these folks follow the right security practices, right? So that's the common thread about, who should consider getting it, or who are the first people who tend to do this. So in reality, what ends up happening is that you will see ISO 27001 being used mostly by tech first or tech forward companies. There are some geographical factors as well. ISO 27001 as a standard is extremely popular in Europe and Asia Pacific, whereas it has a sister standard called SOC2, which is a lot more popular in North America. So depending on the geo and the industry that you see, there is more currency for the standard as compared to other places. But these are typically the most important places where customers tend to do this. If you're a tech first or a tech forward company, it means that you have a lot of data that you process as a company. And that means that security of the data becomes paramount. And then anybody who is working with you needs to start having some assurance that you keep this data safe and secure. And that's typically the trigger for companies to start becoming like ISO 27001 companies. So then you have your usual suspects like your SaaS companies, your technology companies and startups, to larger companies who have a large digital footprint, even though they may not be directly technology companies themselves, but they're tech enabled largely, et cetera, et cetera. That is what starts falling into the gamut.
Yeah. Makes sense. And I think with everything and cloud and data and SaaS, and I mean, data is like every SaaS company is custodians of data of their customers, and
Right.
those customers need some sort of a trust factor. An ISO 2001 with third-party certification is one check mark of the trust factor enablement for doing business.
Exactly.
So since you mentioned SOC2 as a sister concern, I mean, are there differences? Does it mean that if I get ISO 27001, do I automatically get SOC2? Or is just a money-making scheme for a different set of auditor, giving a different label to the same thing that you already are certified for?
Yeah, so it is, the two are different standards, large amounts of overlaps in terms of the actual security practices that you'll end up implementing on the ground if you do either of them. But the two have different governing bodies. They have different ways of talking about the things. They have different rituals, so to speak. But the outcomes and the intents are very, very similar in that sense. So there is a fair degree of overlap. If you as a company find yourself in a position where, let's say, you have customers both in North America and Europe, then you would likely end up doing both SOC 2 and ISO 27001, and you will see that there's a fair degree of overlap between the two. Even though they will have like different rituals, different song and dance about different things, they might call things slightly differently. But in a sense, and in terms of the actual practices that you follow as a company, there'll be a fair degree of overlap.
Okay, good. So I think I want to have a follow-up to that question. To rephrase that question that I asked, of course, you mentioned that and you acknowledge that there is a fair degree of overlap. So if I have ISO 27001 certification, even though it's a different governing body that you mentioned that is doing SOC2, because I have ISO 27001 certification, the time for me to get to SOC2 will be a lot lesser, I assume, right? Because
yes,
of the overlaps.
Yes, it should be in theory. In practice, this is what ends up happening. It depends on actually how you go about both of these programs. I'm obviously biased, and at Sprinto, this is one of the main values that Sprinto brings to the table, that we run these programs in a manner that you can reuse the security practices and the evidence collected around the security practices for both an ISO as well as a SOC 2 audit. And that's where you get large degrees of overlap. But having said that, I've seen many companies who pretty much run these two as independent things, and they get so lost and in all the documentary work and all the nuances of this that they sort of lose the forest for the trees. That is commonplace. So it can happen if you just think about this in terms of working backwards from what the auditors say, and it will look like, okay, there's a lot of different things that you need. But in a sense, really at its core, you should be able to run both of these programs from a common security program. It depends on how you do it. So it's not natural, but if you work towards it, you can actually derive benefits out of it.
Okay. And how long does it take? ISO 27000, how long does to achieve? Like I'm starting day zero, and I want to get 27001 compliance. I got this talk and I want to go back and get it. I mean, we are 27001 compliant, but in your experience, how long does it take?
So I don't want to leave you with an answer which just says it depends. So I'll try to make it a little bit more specific. But the fact is, it's a range, and how long it takes depends on the path you take. So if you use a platform like Sprinto, it's a lot faster. But just to paint a picture of how long it would typically take outside of a platform, I've seen companies, let's say about 50 to 200 people in size. It can easily take you something anywhere between 3 to 9 months, just where you're really working hard towards it, and like you want to make sure everything falls in place. I've typically seen companies take anywhere between, like, on an average at the very least 6 months or more. And in this, if you now add unknowns like something else started getting priority, this lost team, somebody who was on that project is no longer working on that project or left the company, etc. I've seen cases where it gets extended to years and stuff as well. So that's a typical way it works. Of course, if you take the help of technology to run this can become a lot faster. This can happen in a matter of weeks as well, becoming ready for this. because then you are leveraging technology to get in place all the practices and processes that are necessary for this in a very short period of time as well. So you can compress that time. But if you were doing this manually, this typically is like a few months of affair, even for a company that's 50 to 200 people in size. As a company size grows, this can typically become a lot larger as well.
Yeah. At what stage do you think the company should even think about getting it? I mean, I can tell about ourselves because we are in the security field and because we provide, there are certain aspects of the compliance checklist which has to use our products, right? And any compliance checklist. And we ourselves had to be ISO 27001 compliant. So I had to get that going right from day zero when I wanted to start selling to customers as a trust enabler for showing them that I'm serious. But in your experience, at what stage is an absolute must-have beyond which there's absolute no compromise? Should they start looking at ISO 27001?
Right. So actually, I think you passingly mentioned the most common thing that I see. It's a trust enabler, and as a result, it has less to do when you get an ISO 27001 has less to do with the stage where you are as a company, but more to do with the value it adds for whoever your customer for ISO 27001 is, like whether it's a prospect or somebody else, etc. So I've seen like a wide range where I've seen companies who are barely like a handful of employees, but need to get this at the get-go because that's a way for them to establish trust and prove that they are serious about this and they are not a fly-by-night operator where they're going to not be careful about the data that they use as your company. Like you mentioned, SaaS means that I'm a custodian of your data, and they use this as a technique to build that trust from the get-go. So I've seen companies that are barely just formed, just a few days old. They're working at for their first beta customer, their first pilot, and they want this in the pouch, just because it helps increase confidence. But I think if you're not in one of those scenarios, or you're not trying to do this, like you want to break into a new geography where it's important for you to establish trust, or you're trying to break into a new industry where you're trying to establish trust. The other common reason when companies do this is when you grow to a certain size where you now need a way, you need a definitive way of knowing whether you follow right processes as a company rather than just anecdotal evidence that, hey, the people will do what's right. So I've seen once a company gets to a few hundreds of employees, the senior management starts having, like they start depending more on processes than just anecdotal information about, hey, are we doing the right things as a company? And that's not just about information security. That is about various other processes in the company as well. So even if you were not in a scenario where you had to do this at the get-go because an external stakeholder wanted it, I start seeing that there is intrinsic motivation for companies to start becoming ISO 27001 compliant once they get to like a few hundreds of employees in size. Okay,
makes sense. Makes sense. And you mentioned a lot of checklist and a process that enables you to, in a sustainable manner, be secure. So from that list of checklist, is there anything that you can pick up as the most complex, most time consuming? Any challenges from the list of checklist from your experience?
That's a great question. And if I may, I'll take a short segue to answering that. The thing to understand about ISO is that it's a holistic standard. One of the mistakes that I did originally was when I should think about it as a security standard, I used to think that, hey, automatically all the work involved here is going to be around code and vulnerabilities and security related to your infrastructure and your AWS account, etc. But the reality is that the standard encompasses all the departments of your company, and it looks at security a lot more holistically. So what that means is, there is a bunch of practices that you need to start doing as an HR department, as an IT department, as an engineering department, etc. So for example, some of the things consequently that take time is now you need to institute policies in your company. You need to make sure that your employees are aware of these policies, that they acknowledge these policies when they join periodically thereafter. Your employees are going through like a security training program periodically and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of HR implications of this. And this takes a certain amount of time depending on where you are as a company in that process already. Like you might be matured on that already, or you may not be. You need to start having a process around access management, which means the way you grant access to different people in your company to different systems that has to be in a gated manner. Like you randomly, people can't get access to, let's say, your AWS account or your other some sensitive information. You need to have a process of thinking about it, how to grant, change, remove access for people, making sure when people leave the company, their access is revoked safely, and so on and so forth. Change management, how you make changes to your application. So there's a bunch of things that you need to do downstream there. Vulnerability and incident management. This is an important piece. There are many companies who haven't thought about this yet until they start doing a program like ISO 27001. So coming up with a vulnerability management program, looking for vulnerabilities, tracking their severities, making sure that depending on the severities, you close those vulnerabilities in a certain amount of time, pen testing yourself, etc. That becomes like a stream of work, etc. So there are 6 or 7 dimensions along which you need to do work. And I've seen that companies, depending on where they are in the maturity cycle with that dimension, they can take longer or shorter. For example, tech first companies tend to be done some work. They tend to have done some work around, like incident management and vulnerability management or access management, but they are typically fairly short on policies and training and change management and other things. Whereas there are other companies who are not necessarily your normal technology startup. They tend to be a little bit more mature in terms of the HR practices at times, but they are relatively green when it comes to other practices related to vulnerabilities, change management, access management, etc. So you've seen both sides of the thing, but the fact is that it just depends on, as a company, there are some strengths that you have, and those things are usually where you'll be okay, and you need relatively less work, but in other places you will need to do more work.
Makes sense. I know you touched on a few points, which use like vulnerability assessment and pen testing, which is part of the compliance checklist to be not just address one-off, but also have a program to address this on a continuous basis, right?
Yes.
So can you throw some light on what is a specific requirement? And it's a kind of a vested question for me because I see an angle, and through this, I can throw in something that I'm passionate. You are passionate about enabling and reducing the time for meeting compliance. And I'm passionate about helping companies meet compliance around specific to application security where we help them. So within ISO 27001 checklist, what is the vulnerability assessment and pen testing requirement? How often it has to be done? Any light on what specifically is required?
Right. So ISO 27001 will specifically ask you that you have to think holistically about where you should look for vulnerabilities, right? If I'm a software company, I obviously need to look for my vulnerabilities in my application, maybe in my hosting environment, etc. But if I'm basically a different kind of a company, then the vulnerabilities might be elsewhere. But you need to decide where is the right place to look for vulnerabilities. Like I again said, keep saying, like ISO 27001 is a way to think about it. It's a framework rather than saying look at it here itself. But there are natural implications of this. So for example, you should be looking for vulnerabilities in your code base, in your application, in your environment where you're hosting your application as well. And you should do it on a continuous basis. I think, and the more important thing that ISO 27001 says is that it's not just important for you to look at vulnerabilities, but it is important for you to have a clear process as to what are you going to do with vulnerabilities that are found. You need to have a clear policy around, okay, we find a vulnerability, we're going to rate the vulnerability on severity. Like, there is something that tells us that this is the severity of the vulnerability in whatever form, like say low, medium, high, critical, or something like that. And based on the severity, you will have internal SLAs that, okay, if a vulnerability is of so-and-so severity, we as a company are committed to fixing that vulnerability and patching it within a certain amount of time. You could say, okay, for a high vulnerability, I'm going to fix it in, let's say, 7 business days or something like that. So you're basically taking on commitments of the sort that I am going to do this, in a certain amount of time. And depending on the lower vulnerabilities, you could take longer, etc. And the important bit is not only do you find vulnerabilities, you tag them, then you fix them, and you follow this process, and you make sure that you're reviewing the fact that this is actually happening. So it's not just about saying, okay, I have a policy that this is how we do it, but you need to make sure that it is actually being followed. So the program is talking about all of these kind of things. Pen test is also important in this. Like ISO says that you should look at this from both sides. Like you could look for vulnerabilities from an inside in, like from an inside, but you should also do like a black box testing. You should have somebody who is actively looking for vulnerabilities from the outside in your organization, and you should do that at least once a year. And whatever vulnerabilities are found in the pen test, follow the same process that I was talking about earlier. You tag them to the severity, you make sure they're getting fixed in a certain amount of SLA, you follow that process and you collect evidence about the fact that you're doing this. So those are the requirements around vulnerabilities and penetration testing that ISO 27001 usually talk about.
Yeah, good. And I think I like the fact it is not just about finding, but also having some guidelines around having it fixed in a certain amount of time with SLAs
Yes.
and process for getting those. I remember long back in another standard, yet another standard like PCI, it just talked about, yeah, you need to have a process for finding it, and you need to have either fix it or have a firewall. People are not fixing it and having a firewall which is not fixing it too, right? So, and then they said either have to fix it in code or have it patched in a firewall. So the focus is on getting towards fixing it, addressing it, and improving a security posture, which is very refreshing to see that evolution and change happening, not just in the customer mindset, but also the standards and the compliance and the checklist maturing towards that thought process. Wonderful, Girish. You're very, very well articulated. I would want closing thoughts, very much more broader questions. We talked about ISO 27001, but is there a list of compliances that are absolutely must have for SaaS companies specifically, tech first SaaS companies, to have as a must have in order to qualify to sell?
So it depends on the nature of the tech company or the SaaS company. And I'll give specific examples of what I mean by that. If you're a general purpose SaaS company, then the answer about the compliances that you need are almost always geo specific. In the sense, if you're selling in North America, I would recommend typically to start doing SOC2. And if you're selling in Europe or Asia Pacific or Middle East, then ISO 27001 is a good starting point. Eventually, I've seen that most SaaS companies become global SaaS companies, so you would have to likely do both, but then you can at least sequence it, depending on what's more important for you to begin with. So that's a fairly good starting point. But depending on the kind of customers that you have, who might be from specific industries, then or they are from certain geographies, then certain other compliances start becoming important. So, for example, if you're dealing with a customer, or if you, as the nature of your company itself, is going to deal with any healthcare related data, then HIPAA or high trust will get asked of you. So if you're dealing with information that is credit card information related, then PCI will obviously get asked of you. If you're dealing with data of any form which is related to European residents, either directly or indirectly, then you're likely going to get asked for GDPR. The same if you're dealing with data of California residents, and you get asked for CPRA and so on and so forth. So that is like a long tail of compliances which will get asked for depending on the nuances of which geo, which segment, which industry that you sell into. But it's a good starting point. Unless you are if I were a SaaS company in the healthcare space, I would say that do HIPAA first, along with something like SOC2 or ISO. But unless you are in those specific scenarios, ISO 27001 and SOC2 are a good starting points. But then, depending on the specific nature of your business, some other compliances start becoming important, and that's the reason why that alphabet soup exists.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Girish. I think I learned a lot. And my key takeaways from this podcast and what you said was, number one, compliances in general. And today we covered a lot on ISO 27001. Start with thinking of it as a trust enabler for your business to help you gain the trust from your customers. That's a starting point. It's a mindset change as opposed to looking at it as boredom. If you look at it as a sales enabler for you to sell more, even if you think of it as a boredom, it's a necessity must have for your company. The second thing that I heard from you, because there are so many nuances, region-specific nuances, overlaps, commonalities, and other things that you brought about, it's very tough for somebody who's already running at 150 miles an hour for solving that specific problem they are doing to have a get deep and enough understanding of it and especially when it has got a tagline of boredom, right? So enabling and using technologies which will make sure that the common security ground and overlaps and other things can be optimized and further optimize the entire thing to reduce your time to meet the compliance, and hence the time to gain the customer trust is reduced, eventually to build business. Enable and embrace technologies, especially around compliance automation, with players, not necessarily Sprinto, but Sprinto among others, to achieve that, right? So which is the problem pain point that you're solving, which was my second biggest takeaway from this. And ladies and gentlemen, that was Girish. Final word to you, Girish. Any other takeaways that you want to close it off with? But pleasure having you. Last line to you.
Pleasure being here. I don't have much to add. I really enjoyed being here. Thanks for doing this.
Fantastic. Thanks.